The Everlasting Man, Part 6. Moreover, even where the fables are inferior as art, they cannot be properly judged by science, still less properly judged as science. Some myths are very crude and queer, like the early drawings of children, but the child is trying to draw. It is none the less an error to treat his drawing as if it were a diagram, or intended to be a diagram. The student cannot make a scientific statement about the savage, because the savage is not making a scientific statement about the world. He is saying something quite different, what might be called the gossip of the gods. We may say, if we like, that it is believed before there is time to examine it. It would be truer to say it is accepted before there is time to believe it. I confess I doubt the whole theory of the dissemination of myths, or, as it commonly is, of one myth. It is true that something in our nature and conditions make many stories similar, but each of them may be original. One man does not borrow the story from another man, though he may tell it from the same motive as the other man. It would be easy to apply the whole argument about legend to literature, and to turn it into a vulgar monomania of plagiarism. I would undertake to trace a notion like that of the Golden Bough through individual modern novels as easily as through communal and antiquated myths. I would undertake to find something like a bunch of flowers figuring again and again, from the fatal bouquet of Becky Sharp to the spray of roses sent by the Princess of Ruritania. But though these flowers may spring from the same soil, it is not the same faded flower that is flung from hand to hand. Those flowers are always fresh. The true origin of all the myths have been discovered much too often. They are too many keys to mythology, as there are too many cryptograms in Shakespeare. Everything is phallic, everything is totemistic, everything is seed time and harvest, everything is ghosts and grave offerings, everything is the golden bough of sacrifice. Everything is the sun and moon, everything is everything. Every folklore student who knew a little more than his own monomania, every man of wider reading and critical culture, like Andrew Lang, has practically confessed that the bewilderment of these things left his brain spinning. Yet the whole trouble comes from a man trying to look at these stories from the outside, as if they were scientific objects. He has only to look at them from the inside, and ask himself how he would begin a story. A story may start with anything and go anywhere. It may start with a bird without the bird being a totem. It may start with the sun without being a solar myth. It is said that there are only 10 plots in the world, and there will certainly be common and recurrent elements. Set 10,000 children talking at once and telling taradiddles about what they did in the wood, and it will not be hard to find parallels suggesting sun worship or animal worship. Some of the stories may be pretty and some silly and perhaps dirty, but they can only be judged as stories. In the modern dialect, they can only be judged aesthetically. It is strange that aesthetics, or mere feeling, which is now allowed to usurp where it has no rights at all, to wreck reason with pragmatism and morals with anarchy, apparently not allowed to give a purely aesthetic judgment on what is obviously a purely aesthetic question. We may be fanciful about everything except fairy tales. Now, the first fact is that the most simple people have the most subtle ideas. Everybody ought to know that, for everybody had been a child. Ignorant as a child is, he knows more than he can say and feels not only atmospheres, but fine shades. And in this matter there are several fine shades. Nobody understands it who has not had what can only be called the ache of the artist to find some sense and some story in the beautiful things he sees. His hunger for secrets and his anger at any tower or tree escaping with its tale untold. He feels that nothing is perfect unless it is personal. Without the blind consciousness, beauty of the world stands in its gardens like a headless statue. One need only be a very minor poet to have wrestled with the tower or the tree until it spoke like a Titan or a Dryad. It is often said that pagan mythology was a personification of the powers of nature. The phrase is true in a sense, but it is very unsatisfactory, because it implies that the forces are abstractions and the personification is artificial. Myths are not allegories. Natural powers are not, in this case, abstractions. It is not as if there was a god of gravitation. There may be a genius of the waterfall, but not of mere falling, even less than of mere water. The impersonation is not of something impersonal. The point is that the personality perfects the water with significance. Father Christmas is not an allegory of snow and holly. He is not merely the stuff called snow, afterwards artificially given a human form, like a snowman. He is something that gives a new meaning to the white world and the evergreens, so that snow itself seems to be warm rather than cold. The test, therefore, is purely imaginative. But imaginative does not mean imaginary. It does not follow that it is all what the moderns call subjective when they mean false. Every true artist does feel, consciously or unconsciously, that he is seeing transcendental truths, and that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. In other words, the natural mystic does know that there is something there, something behind the clouds or within the trees, but he believes that the pursuit of beauty is the way to find it, that imagination is a sort of incantation that can call it up. Now we do not comprehend this process in ourselves, so far as in our most remote fellow creatures, and the danger of these things being classified is that they may seem to be comprehended. A really fine work of folklore, like the Golden Bough, will leave too many readers with the idea, for instance, that this or that story of a giant's or wizard's heart in a casket or in a cave only means some stupid and static superstition called the external soul. But we do not know what these things mean, simply because we do not know what we ourselves mean when we are moved by them. Suppose somebody in a story says, "Pluck this flower and a princess will die in a castle beyond the sea." We do not know why something stirs in the subconsciousness, or why what is impossible seems almost inevitable. Suppose we read, "And in the hour when the king extinguished the candle, his ships were wrecked far away on the coast of Hebrides." We do not know why the imagination has accepted that image before the reason can reject it, or why such correspondences seem really to correspond to something in the soul. Very deep things in our nature, some dim sense of the independence of great things upon small, and some dark suggestion that the things nearest to us stretch far beyond our power, some sacramental feeling of the magic in material substances, and many more emotions past fading out, are in an idea like that of the external soul. The power even in the myths of savages is like the power in the metaphor of poets. The soul of such a metaphor is often very emphatically an external soul. The best critics have remarked that in the best poets the simile is often a picture that seems quite separate from the text. It is as irrelevant as the remote castle to the flower or the Hebridean coast to the candle. Shelley compares the skylark to a young woman on a turret, to a rose embedded in thick foliage, to a series of things that seem to be about as unlike a skylark in the sky as anything we can imagine. I suppose that the most potent piece of pure magic in English literature is the much quoted passage in Keats' Nightingale about the casements opening on the perilous form, and nobody notices that the image seems to come from nowhere, that it appears abruptly after some equally almost irrelevant remarks about Ruth, and that it has nothing in the world to do with the subject of the poem. If there is one place in the world where nobody could reasonably expect to find a nightingale, it is on a window-sill at a seaside. But it is only in the same sense that nobody would expect to find a giant's heart in a casket under the sea. Now it would be very dangerous to classify the metaphors of the poets. When Shelley says that the cloud will rise like a child from the womb, like a ghost from the tomb, it would be quite possible to call the first a case of the coarse primitive birth myth, and the second a survival of the ghost worship which became ancestor worship. But it is the wrong way of dealing with a cloud, and is liable to leave the learned in the conditions of Polonius, only too ready to think it like a weasel, or very like a whale. The two facts follow from this psychology of daydreams, which must be kept in mind throughout their development in mythologies and even religions. First, these imaginative impressions are often strictly local. So far from being abstractions turned into allegories, they are often images almost concentrated into idols. The poet feels the mystery of a particular forest, not of the science of afforestation, or the department of woods and forests. He worships the peak of a particular mountain, not the abstract idea of altitude. So we find the god is not merely water, but often one special river. He may be the sea, because the sea is single, like a stream, the river that runs around the world. Ultimately, doubtless many deities are enlarged into elements, but they are something more than omnipresent. Apollo does not merely dwell wherever the sun shines. His home is on the rock of Delphi. Diana is great enough to be in three places at once, earth and heaven and hell. But greater is Diana of the Ephesians. This localized feeling had its lowest form in the mere fetish or talisman, such as millionaires put on their motor cars. But it can also harden into something like a high and serious religion, where it is connected with high and serious duties, into the gods of the city or even the gods of the hearth. The second consequence is this, that in these pagan cults there is every shade of sincerity and insincerity. In what sense exactly did an Athenian really think he had to sacrifice to Pallas Athena? What scholar is really certain of the answer? In what sense did Dr. Johnson really think that he had to touch all the posts in the street, or that he ought to collect orange peel? In what sense does a child really think that he ought to step on every alternate paving stone? Two things are at least fairly clear. First, in simpler and less self-conscious times, these forms could become more solid without really becoming more serious. Daydreams could be acted in broad daylight with more liberty of artistic expression, but still perhaps with something of the light step of the somnambulist. Wrap Dr. Johnson in an antique mantle, crown him, by his kind permission, with a garland, and he will move in state under those ancient skies of morning, touching a series of sacred posts carved with the heads of the strange terminal animals that stand at the limits of the land and of the life of man. Make the child free of the marbles and mosaics of some classic temples to play on a whole floor inlaid with squares of black and white, and he will willingly make this fulfillment of his idle and drifting daydream the clear field for a grave and graceful dance. But the posts and the paving stones are a little more or a little less real than they are under modern limits. They are not really much more serious for being taken seriously. They have had the sort of sincerity that they have always had, the sincerity of art as a symbol that expresses the very real spiritualities under the surface of life. But they are only sincere in the same sense as art, not sincere in the same sense as morality. The eccentric's collection of orange peel may turn to oranges in a Mediterranean festival, or to golden apples in a Mediterranean myth. But they are never on the same plane, with the difference between giving the orange to a blind beggar and carefully placing the orange peel so that the beggar may fall and break his leg. Between these two things there is a difference of kind and not of degree. The child does not think it wrong to step on the paving stone as he thinks it's wrong to step on the dog's tail. And it is very certain that whatever jest or sentiment or fancy first set Johnson touching the wooden posts, he never touched wood with any of the feeling with which he stretched out his hands to the timber of that terrible tree, which was the death of God and the life of man. As already noted, this does not mean that there was no reality or even no religious sentiment in such a mood. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church has taken over with uproarious success the whole of this popular business of giving people local legends and lighter ceremonial movements. Insofar as all this sort of paganism was innocent and in touch with nature, there is no reason why it should not be patronized by patron saints as much as by pagan gods. And in any case, there are degrees of seriousness in the most natural make-believe. There is all the difference between fancying there are fairies in the wood, which often only means fancying a certain wood as fit for fairies, and really frightening ourselves until we walk a mile rather than pass a house we have already told ourselves is haunted. Behind all these things is the fact that beauty and terror are very real things and related to a real spiritual world. And to touch them all, even in doubt or fancy, is to stir the deep things of the soul. We all understand, and the pagans understood it. The point is that paganism did not really stir the soul except with these doubts and fancies, with the consequence that we today can have little beyond doubts and fancies about paganism. All the best critics agree that all the greatest poets, in pagan Hellas, for example, had an attitude towards their gods which is quite queer and puzzling to men in the Christian era. There seems to be an admitted conflict between the god and the man, but everybody seems to be doubtful about which is the hero and which is the villain. This doubt does not merely apply to a doubter like Euripides in the Bacchae. It applies to a moderate conservative like Sophocles in the Antigone, or even to a regular Tory and reactionary like Aristophanes in Frogs. Sometimes it would seem that the Greeks believed above all things in reverence, only they had nobody to revere. But the point of the puzzle is this, that all this vagueness and variation arise from the fact that the whole thing began in fancy and in dreaming, that there are no rules of architecture for a castle in the clouds. This is the mighty and branching tree called mythology, which ramifies round the whole world, whose remote branches under the separate skies bear like colored birds the costly idols of Asia and the half-baked fetishes of Africa, and the fairy kings and princesses of the folk tales of the forest, and buried amid vines and olives in the lairs of the Latins, and carried on the clouds of Olympus the buoyant supremacy of the gods of Greece. These are the myths, and he who has no sympathy with myths has no sympathy with men. But he has the most sympathy with myths will most fully realize that they are not and never were a religion, in the sense that Christianity or even Islam is a religion. They satisfy some of the needs satisfied by a religion, and notably the need for doing certain things at certain dates, the need of the twin ideas of festivity and formality. But though they provide a man with a calendar, they do not provide him with a creed. A man did not stand up and say, "I believe in Jupiter and Juno and Neptune, etc., as he stands up and says, "I believe in God the Father Almighty," and the rest of the Apostles' Creed. Many believed in some and not in others, or more in some and less than others, or in a very vague poetical sense in any. There was no amount, when they were all collected into an orthodox order, which men would fight and be tortured to keep intact. Still less did anybody ever say in that fashion, I believe in Odin and Thor and Freya. For outside Olympus, even the Olympian order grows cloudy and chaotic. It seems clear to me that Thor was not a god at all, but a hero. Nothing resembling a religion would picture anybody resembling a god as groping like a pygmy in a great cavern that turned out to be the glove of a giant. That in the glorious ignorance called adventure, Thor may have been a great adventurer, but to call him a god is like trying to compare Jehovah with Jack and the Beanstalk. Odin seems to have been a real barbarian chief, possibly of the Dark Ages after Christianity. Polytheism fades away at its fringes into fairy tales or barbaric memories. It is not a thing like monotheism as held by serious monotheists. Again, it does not satisfy the need to cry out on some uplifted name and some noble memory in moments that are themselves noble and uplifted, such as the birth of a child or the saving of a city. But the name was so used by many to whom it was only a name. Finally, it did satisfy, or rather it partially satisfied, a thing very deep in humanity indeed. The idea of surrendering something as the portion of the unknown powers, of the pouring of wine upon the ground, of throwing a ring into the sea, in a word, of sacrifice. It is the wise and worthy idea of not taking our advantage to the full, of putting something in the other balance to ballast our dubious pride, of paying tithes to nature for our land. This deep truth of the dangers of insolence, or being too big for our boots, runs through all the Greek tragedies and makes them great. But it runs side by side with an almost cryptic agnosticism about the real nature of the gods to be propitiated. Where that gesture of surrender is most magnificent, as among the great Greeks, there is really much more idea that the man will be the better for losing the ox than that the god will be the better for getting it. It is said that in its grosser forms there are often actions grotesquely suggestive of the god really eating the sacrifice. But this fact is falsified by the error that I put first in this note on mythology. It is misunderstanding the psychology of daydreams. A child pretending there is a goblin in a hollow tree will do a crude and material thing, like leaving a piece of cake for him. A poet might do a more dignified and elegant thing, like bringing to the gods fruits as well as flowers. But the degree of seriousness in both acts may be the same in it, or vary to almost any degree. The crude fancy is no more a creed than the ideal fancy of a creed. Certainly the pagan does not disbelieve like an atheist, any more than he believes like a Christian. He feels the presence of powers about which he guesses and invents. St. Paul said that the Greeks had one altar to an unknown God. But in their truth, all their gods were unknown gods. And the real break in history did come when St. Paul declared to them whom they had ignorantly worshipped. The substance of all such paganism may be summarized thus. It is an attempt to reach the divine reality through the imagination alone. In its own field, reason does not restrain it at all. It is vital to view of all history that reason is something separate from religion, even in the most rational of these civilizations. It is only as an afterthought, when such cults are decadent or on the defensive, that a few Neoplatonists or a few Brahmins are found trying to rationalize them. And even then only by trying to allegorize them. But in reality the rivers of mythology and philosophy run parallel and do not mingle till they meet in the sea of Christendom. Simple secularists still talk as if the Church had introduced a sort of schism between reason and religion. The truth is that the Church was actually the first thing that ever tried to combine reason and religion. There had never been before such union of the priests and the philosophers. Mythology, then, sought God through the imagination, or sought truth by means of beauty, in the sense in which beauty includes much of the most grotesque ugliness. But the imagination has its own laws, and therefore its own triumphs, which neither logicians or men of science can understand. It remained true to that imaginative instinct through 1,000 extravagances, through every crude cosmic pantomime of a pig eating the moon, or the world being cut out of a cow, through all the dizzy convolutions and mystic malformations of Asiatic art, through the stark and staring rigidity of Egyptian and Assyrian portraiture, through every kind of cracked mirror of mad art that seemed to deform the world and displace the sky, it remained true to something about which there can be no argument. Something that makes it possible for some artist of some school to stand suddenly still before that particular deformity and say, "My dream has come true." Therefore do we all in fact feel the pagan or primitive myths are infinitely suggestive, so long as we are wise enough not to inquire what they suggest. Therefore we all feel what is meant by Prometheus stealing fire from heaven, or some prig of a pessimist or progressive person explains what it means. Therefore we all know the meaning of Jack and the Beanstalk, until we are told. In this sense it is true that it is ignorant who accepts myths, but only because it is the ignorant who appreciate poems. Imagination has its own laws and triumphs, and a tremendous power began to clothe its images, whether images in the mind or in the mud, whether in the bamboo of the South Sea Islands or the marble of the mountains of Hellas. But there has always been a trouble in the triumph, which in these pages I had tried to analyze in vain, but perhaps I might in conclusion state it thus. The crux and crisis that man found it natural to worship, even natural to worship unnatural things. The posture of the idol might be stiff and strange, but the gesture of the worshipper was generous and beautiful. He not only felt freer when he bent, he actually felt taller when he bowed. Henceforth anything that took away the gesture of worship would stunt and even maim him forever. Henceforth being merely secular would be a servitude and an inhibition. If man cannot pray, he is gagged. If he cannot kneel, he is in irons. We therefore feel throughout the whole of paganism a curious double feeling of trust and distrust. When the man makes the gesture of salutation and of sacrifice, when he pours out the libation or lifts up the sword, he knows he is doing a worthy and virile thing. He knows he is doing one of the things for which a man was made. His imaginative experiment is therefore justified. But precisely because it began with imagination, there is to the end something of mockery in it, and especially in the object of it. This mockery, in the more intense moments of the intellect, becomes the almost intolerable irony of Greek tragedy. There seems a disproportion between the priest and the altar, or between the altar and the god. Priest seems more solemn and almost more sacred than the god. All the order of the temple is solid and sane and satisfactory to certain parts of our nature, except the very center of it, which seems strangely mutable and dubious, like a dancing flame. It is the first thought round which the whole has been built, and the first thought is still a fancy and almost a frivolity. In that strange place of meeting, the man seems more statuesque than the statue. He himself can stand forever in the noble and natural attitude of the statue of the praying boy. But whatever name be written on the pedestal, whether Zeus or Ammon or Apollo, the god whom he worships is Proteus. The praying boy may be said to express a need rather than to satisfy a need. It is by a normal and necessary action that his hands are lifted, but it is no less a parable that his hands are empty. About the nature of that need there will be more to say. But at this point it may be said that perhaps after all this true instinct, that prayer and sacrifice are a liberty and an enlargement, refers back to that vast and half-forgotten conception of universal fatherhood, which we have already seen everywhere fading from the morning sky. This is true, and yet it is not all the truth. There remains an indestructible instinct in the poet as presented by the pagan, that he is not entirely wrong in localizing his God. It is something in the soul of poetry, if not of piety. And the greatest of poets, when he defined the poet, did not say that he gave us the universe or the absolute or the infinite, but, in his own larger language, a local habitation and a name. No poet is merely a pantheist. Those who are counted most pantheistic, like Shelley, start with some local or particular image as the pagans did. After all, Shelley wrote of the skylark because it was a skylark. You could not issue an imperial or international translation of it for use in South America, in which it was changed to an ostrich. So the mythological imagination moves, as it were, in circles, hovering either to find a place or to return to it. In a word, mythology is a search. It is something that combines a recurrent desire with a recurrent doubt, mixing a most hungry sincerity in the idea of seeking for a place, with most dark and deep and mysterious levity about all the places found. So indeed could the lonely imagination lead, and we must later turn to the lonely reason. Nowhere along this road did the two ever travel together. That is where all these things differed from religion, or the reality in which these different dimensions met in a sort of solid. They differed from the reality not in what they looked like, but in what they were. A picture may look like a landscape. It may look in every detail exactly like a landscape. The only detail in which it differs is that it is not a landscape. The difference is only that which divides a portrait of Queen Elizabeth from Queen Elizabeth. Only in this mythical and mystical world the portrait could exist before the person, and the portrait was therefore more vague and doubtful. But anyone who has felt and fed on the atmosphere of these myths will know what I mean. And when I say that in one sense they did not really profess to be realities, the pagans had dreams about realities, and they would have been the first to admit, in their own words, that some came through the gate of ivory and others through the gate of horn. The dreams do indeed tend to be very vivid dreams, when they touch on those tender or tragic things which can really make a sleeper awaken with the sense that his heart has been broken in his sleep. They tend continually to hover over certain passionate themes of meeting and parting, of a life that ends in death, or a death that is the beginning of life. Demeter wanders over a stricken world looking for a stolen child. Isis stretches out her arms over the earth in vain to gather the limbs of Osiris, and there is lamentation upon the hills for Attis, and through the woods for Adonis. There mingles with all such mourning the mystical and profound sense that death can be a deliverer and an appeasement. That such death gives us a divine blood for a renovating river, and that all good is found in gathering the broken body of the god. We may truly call these foreshadowing, so long as we remember that foreshadowings are shadows. And the metaphor of a shadow happens to hit exactly the truth that is very vital here. For a shadow is a shape, a thing which reproduces shape, but not texture. These things were something like the real thing, and to say that they were like is to say that they were different. To say something is like a dog is another way of saying it is not a dog. And it is in this sense of identity that a myth is not a man. Nobody really thought of Isis as a human being. Nobody really thought of Demeter as a historical character. Nobody thought of Adonis as the founder of a church. There was no idea that any of them had changed the world, but rather that their recurrent death and life bore the sad and beautiful burden of the changelessness of the world. Not one of them was a revolution, save in the sense of the revolution of the sun and moon. Their whole meaning is missed if we do not see that they mean the shadows that we are and the shadows that we pursue. In certain sacrificial and communal aspects, they naturally suggest what sort of a god might satisfy them, but they do not profess to be satisfied. Anyone who says they do is a bad judge of poetry. Those who talk about pagan Christs have less sympathy with paganism than with Christianity. Those who call these cults religions and compare them with the certitude and challenge of the church have much less appreciation than we have of what made heathenism human, or of why the classic literature is still something that hangs in the air like a song. It is no very human tenderness for the hungry to prove that hunger is the same as food. It is no very genial understanding of youth to argue that hope destroys the need for happiness. And it is utterly unreal to argue that these images in the mind, admired entirely in the abstract, were even in the same world with a living man and a living polity, that were worshipped because they were concrete. We might as well say that a boy playing at robbers is the same as the man in his first day in the trenches, or that boys' first fancies about the not impossible she are the same as the sacrament of marriage. They are fundamentally different exactly where they are superficially similar. We might almost say that they are not the same even when they are the same. They are only different because one is real and the other is not. I do not mean merely that that I myself believe that one is true and the other is not. I mean that one was never meant to be true in the same sense as the other. The sense in which it was meant to be true I have tried to suggest vaguely here, but it is undoubtedly very subtle and almost indescribable. It is so subtle that the students who profess to put it up as a rival to our religion miss the whole meaning and purport of their own study. We know better than the scholars, even those of us who are no scholars, what was in that hollow cry that went forth over the dead Adonis, and why the Great Mother had a daughter wedded to death. We have entered more deeply than they into the Eleusinian mysteries, where gate within gate guarded the wisdom of Orpheus. We know the meaning of all these myths. We know the last secret revealed to the perfect initiate. It is not the voice of a priest or a prophet saying, "These things are." It is the voice of a dreamer and an idealist crying, "Why cannot these things be?" Chapter 6. The Demons and the Philosophers. I have dwelt at some little length on this imaginative sort of paganism, which has crowded the world with temples, and is everywhere the parent of popular festivity. For the central history of civilization, as I see it, consists of two further stages before the final stage of Christendom. First was the struggle between this paganism and something less worthy than itself, and the second, the process by which it grew in itself less worthy. In this very varied and often very vague polytheism, there was a weakness of original sin. The pagan gods were depicted as tossing men like dice, and indeed they are loaded dice. About sex especially, men are born unbalanced. We might also say men are born mad. They scarcely reach sanity until they reach sanctity. This disproportion dragged down the winged fancies and filled the end of paganism with a mere filth and litter of spawning gods. But the first point is to realize that this sort of paganism had an early collusion with another sort of paganism, and that the issue of that essentially spiritual struggle really determined the history of the world. In order to understand it, we must pass to a review of the other kind of paganism. It can be considered much more briefly. Indeed, there is a very real sense in which the less that is said about it, the better. If we have called the first sort of mythology the daydream, we might very well call the second sort of mythology the nightmare. Superstition recurs in all ages, especially in rationalistic ages. I remember defending the religious tradition against a whole luncheon table of distinguished agnostics, and before the end of our conversation every one of them had procured from his pocket or exhibited on his watch chain some charm or talisman from which he admitted that he was never separated. I was the only person present who had neglected to provide himself with a fetish. Superstition recurs in a rationalistic age because it rests on something which, if not identical with rationalism, is not unconnected with skepticism. It is at least very closely connected with agnosticism. It rests on something that is really a very human and intelligible sentiment, like the local invocations of the Newman in popular paganism. But it is an agnostic sentiment, for it rests on two feelings. First, that we do not really know the laws of the universe, and second, that they may be very different to all we call reason. Such men realize the real truth that enormous things do often turn upon tiny things. When a whisper comes, from tradition or whatnot, that one particular tiny thing is the key or clue, something deep and not altogether senseless in human nature tells them that it is not unlikely. This feeling exists in both the forms of paganism here under consideration. But when we come to the second form of it, we find it transformed and filled with another and more terrible spirit. In dealing with the lighter thing called mythology, I have said little about the most disputable aspect of it. The extent to which such invocations of the spirits of the sea or of the elements can indeed call spirits from the vasty deep. Or rather, as Shakespearean scoffer put it, whether the spirits come when they are called. I believe that I am right in thinking that this problem, practical as it sounds, does not play a dominant part in the poetical business of mythology. But I think it is even more obvious, on the evidence, that things of that sort have sometimes appeared, even if they were only appearances. But when we come to the world of superstition, in a more subtle sense, there is a shade of difference, a deepening and darkening shade. Doubtless, most popular superstition is as frivolous as any popular mythology. Men do not believe as a dogma that God would throw a thunderbolt at them for walking under a ladder. More often they amuse themselves with the not very laborious exercise of walking around it. There is no more in it than what I have already adumbrated. A sort of airy agnosticism about the possibilities of so strange a world. But there is another sort of superstition that does definitely look for results, that might be called a realistic superstition. And with that question of whether spirits do answer or do appear becomes much more serious. As I have said, it seems to me pretty certain that they sometimes do. But about that there is a distinction that has been the beginning of much evil in the world. Whether it be because the fall has really brought men nearer to less desirable neighbors in the spiritual world, or whether it is merely that the mood of men, eager or greedy, finds it easier to imagine evil, I believe that the black magic of witchcraft has been much more practical and much less poetical than the white magic of mythology. I fancy the garden of the witch has been kept much more carefully than the woodland of the nymph. I fancy the evil field that has been more fruitful than the good. To start with, some impulse, perhaps a sort of desperate impulse, drove men to the darker powers when dealing with practical problems. There was a sort of secret and perverse feeling that the darker powers would really do things, that they had no nonsense about them. And indeed that popular phrase exactly expresses the point. The gods of mere mythology had a great deal of nonsense about them. They had a great deal of good nonsense about them, in the happy and hilarious sense in which we talk of the nonsense of Jabberwocky, or the land where Jumblies live. But the man consulting a demon felt as many a man has felt in consulting a detective, especially a private detective, that it was dirty work, but the work would really be done. A man did not exactly go into the wood to meet a nymph. He rather went with the hope of meeting a nymph. It was an adventure rather than an assignation. But the devil really kept his appointments, and even in one sense kept his promises, even if a man can sometimes wishes afterwards, like Macbeth, that he has broken them. In the accounts given us of many rude or savage races, we gather that the cult of demons often came after the cult of deities, and even after the cult of one single and supreme deity. It may be suspected that in almost all such places the higher deity is felt to be far off for appeal in certain petty matters, and men invoke the spirits because they are in a more literal sense familiar spirits. But with the idea of employing the demons who get things done, a new idea appears more worthy of the demons. It may indeed be truly described as the idea of being worthy of the demons, of making oneself fit for their fastidious and exacting society. Superstition, of the lighter sort, toys with the idea that some trifle, some small gesture, as throwing the salt, may touch the hidden spring that works the mysterious machinery of the world. And there is, after all, something in the idea of such an open sesame. But with the appeal to lower spirits comes the horrible notion that the gesture must not be very small but very low, that it must be a monkey trick of an utterly ugly and unworthy sort. Sooner or later a man deliberately sets himself to do the most disgusting thing he can think of. It is felt that the extreme of evil will extort a sort of attention or answer from the evil powers under the surface of the world. This is the meaning of most of the cannibalism of the world. For most, cannibalism is not a primitive or even a bestial habit. It is artificial and even artistic, a sort of art for art's sake. Men do not do it because they do not think it horrible, but on the contrary, because they do think it horrible. They wish, in the most literal sense, to sup on horrors. That is why it is often found that rude races like the Australian natives are not cannibals, while much more refined and intelligent races like the New Zealand Maoris occasionally are. They are refined and intelligent enough to indulge sometimes in a self-conscious diabolism. But if we could understand their minds, or even really understand their language, we should probably find that they were not acting as ignorant, that is, as innocent cannibals. They are not doing it because they do not think it wrong, but precisely because they do think it wrong. They are acting like a Parisian decadent at a black mass. But the black mass has to hide underground from the presence of the real mass. In other words, the demons have really been in hiding since the coming of Christ on earth. The cannibalism of the higher barbarians is in hiding from the civilization of the white man. But before Christendom, especially outside Europe, this was not always so. In the ancient world, the demons often wandered abroad like dragons. They could be positively and publicly enthroned as gods. Their enormous images could be set up in public temples in the center of populous cities. And all over the world the traces can be found of this striking and solid fact, so curiously overlooked by the moderns who speak of all such evil as primitive and early in evolution, that as a matter of fact some of the very highest civilizations of the world were the very places where the horns of Satan were exalted, not only to the stars, but in the face of the sun. Take, for example, the Aztecs and American Indians of ancient empires of Mexico and Peru. They were at least as elaborate as Egypt or China, and only less lively than that central civilization which is our own. But those who criticize that central civilization, which is always their own civilization, have a curious habit of not merely doing their legitimate duty in condemning its crimes, but of going out of their way to idealize its victims. They always assume that before the advent of Europe there was nothing anywhere but Eden. And Swinburne, in that spirited chorus of the nations in Songs Before Sunrise, used an expression about Spain in her South American conquests which always struck me as very strange. He said something about her sins and sons through sinless lands dispersed, and how they made accursed the name of man, and thrice accursed the name of God. It may be reasonable enough that he should say the Spaniards were sinful, but why in the world should he say that the South Americans were sinless? Why should we have to suppose that continent to be exclusively populated by archangels or saints perfect in heaven? It would be a strong thing to say of the most respectable neighborhood, but when we come to think of what we really do know of that society, the remark is rather funny. We know that the sinless priests of this sinless people worship sinless gods, who accepted as nectar and ambrosia of their sunny paradise nothing but the incessant human sacrifice accompanied by horrible torments. We may note also in the mythology of this American civilization that element of reversal or violence against instinct of which Dante wrote. which runs backwards everywhere through the unnatural religion of the demons. It is notable that not only in ethics, but in aesthetics, a South American idol was made as ugly as possible, as a Greek image was made as beautiful as possible. They were seeking the secret of power by working backwards against their own nature and the nature of things. There was always a sort of yearning to carve at last, in gold or granite or the dark red timber of the forests, a face at which the sky itself would break like a cracked mirror. In any case, it is clear enough that the painted and gilded civilization of tropical America systematically indulged in human sacrifice. It is by no means clear, as far as I know, that the Eskimos ever indulged in human sacrifice. They were not civilized enough. They were too closely imprisoned by the white winter and the endless dark. Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. It was in brighter days and broader daylight that the noble rage is found unmistakably raging. It was in richer and more instructed lands that the genial current flowed on the stars, to be drunk by great gods wearing goggling and grinning masks, and called on in terror or torment by long cacophonous names that sound like laughter in hell. A warmer climate and a more scientific cultivation were needed to bring forth these blooms, to draw up towards the sun the large leaves and flamboyant blossoms that gave their gold and crimson and purple to that garden, which Swinburne compares to the Hesperides. There was at least no doubt about the dragon. I do not raise in this connection the special controversy about Spain and Mexico, but I may remark in passing that it resembles exactly the question that must in some sense be raised afterwards about Rome and Carthage. In both cases there has been a queer habit among the English of always siding against the Europeans, and representing the rival civilization, in Swinburne's phrase, as sinless, when its sins were obviously crying or rather screaming to heaven, for Carthage also was a high civilization, indeed a much more highly civilized civilization. And Carthage also founded that civilization on a religion of fear, sending up everywhere the smoke of human sacrifice. Now it is very right to rebuke our own race or religion for falling short of our own standards and ideals, but it is absurd to pretend that they fell lower than the other races and religions that professed the very opposite standards and ideals. There is a very real sense in which the Christian is worse than the heathen, the Spaniard worse than the Red Indian, and even the Roman potentially worse than the Carthaginian. But there is one sense in which he is worse, and that is not in being positively worse. The Christian is only worse because it is his business to be better. This inverted imagination produces things of which it is better not to speak. Some of them indeed might almost be named without being known, for they are of that extreme evil which seems innocent to the innocent. They are too inhuman even to be indecent. But without dwelling much longer in these dark corners, it may be noted not as irrelevant that here certain anti-human antagonisms seem to recur in this tradition of black magic. There may be suspected as running through it everywhere, for instance, a mystical hatred of the idea of childhood. People would understand better the popular fury against the witches if they remembered that the malice most commonly attributed to them was preventing the birth of children. The Hebrew prophets were perpetually protesting against the Hebrew race relapsing into an idolatry that involved such a war upon children. And it is probable enough that this abominable apostasy from the God of Israel has occasionally appeared in Israel's sense in the form of what is called ritual murder, not of course by any representative of the religion of Judaism, but by individual and irresponsible diabolists who did happen to be Jews. This sense that the forces of evil especially threaten childhood is found again in the enormous popularity of the child martyr of the Middle Ages. Chaucer did but give another version of a very national English legend when he conceived the wickedness of all possible witches as the dark alien woman watching behind her high lattice and heading, like the babble of a brook down a stony street, the singing of little St. Hugh. Anyhow, the part of such speculations that concerns this story centered especially around that eastern end of the Mediterranean, where the nomads had turned gradually into traders and had begun to trade with the whole world. Indeed, the sense of trade and travel and colonial extension, it already had something like the empire of the whole world. Its purple dye, the emblem of its rich pomp and luxury, had steeped the wares which were sold far away amid the last crags of Cornwall, and the sails that entered the silence of tropic seas amid all the mystery of Africa. It might be truly said to have painted the map purple. It was already a worldwide success, when the princes of Tyre would hardly have troubled to notice one of their princesses had condescended to marry the chief of some tribe called Judah, when the merchants of its African outpost would only have curled their bearded and Semitic lips with a slight smile at the mention of a village called Rome. And indeed, no two things could have seemed more distant from each other, not only in space, but in spirit, that the monotheism of the Palestinian tribe and the very virtues of the small Italian republic. There was but one thing between them, and the thing which divided them has united them. Very various and incompatible were the things that could be loved by the consuls of Rome and the prophets of Israel, but they were at once in what they hated. It is very easy in both cases to represent that hatred as something merely hateful. It is easy enough to make a merely harsh and inhuman figure either of Elijah raving about the slaughter of Carmel, or Cato thundering against the amnesty of Africa. These men had their limitations and their local passions, but this criticism of them is unimaginative and therefore unreal. It leaves out something immense and intermediate, facing east and west and calling up this passion in its eastern and western enemies. And that something is the first subject of this chapter. The civilization that centered in Tyre and Sidon was above all things practical. It has little left in the way of art and nothing in the way of poetry. But it prided itself upon being very efficient, and it followed in its philosophy and religion that strange and sometimes secret train of thought which we have already noted in those who look for immediate effects. There is always in such a mentality an idea that there is a short cut to the secret of all success, something that would shock the world by this sort of shameless thoroughness. They believed, in the appropriate modern phrase, in people who delivered the goods. In their dealings with their god Moloch, they themselves were always careful to deliver the goods. It was an interesting transaction, upon which we shall have to touch more than once on the subject of the narrative. It is enough to say here that it involved the theory I have suggested about a certain attitude towards children. This was what called up against it in simultaneous fury the servant of one god in Palestine and the guardians of all the household gods in Rome. This is what challenged two things naturally so much divided that every sort of distance and disunion, whose union was to save the world. I have called the fourth and final division of the spiritual elements, into which I should divide heathen humanity, by the name of the philosophers. I confess that it covers in my mind much that would generally be classified otherwise, and that what are here called philosophies are very often called religions. I believe, however, that my own description will be found to be much the more realistic and not the less respectful. But we must first take philosophy in its purest and clearest form, that we may trace its normal outline, and that is to be found in the world of the purest and clearest outlines, that culture of the Mediterranean of which we have been considering the mythologies and idolatries in the last two chapters. Polytheism, or that aspect of paganism, was never to the pagan what Catholicism is to the Catholic. It was never a view of the universe satisfying all sides of life, a complete and complex truth with something to say about everything. It was only a satisfaction of one side of the soul of man, even if we call it the religious side, and I think it is truer to call it the imaginative side. But this it did satisfy. In the end it satisfied it to satiety. All that world was a tissue of interwoven tales and cults, and there ran in and out of it, as we have already seen, that black thread among its more blameless colors, the darker paganism that was really diabolism. But we all know that this did not mean that all pagan men thought of nothing but pagan gods. Precisely because mythology only satisfied one mood, they turned in other moods to something totally different. But it is important to realize that it was totally different. It was too different to be inconsistent. It was so alien that it did not clash. While a mob of people were pouring on a public holiday to the feast of Adonis, or the games in honor of Apollo, this or that man would prefer to stop at home and think out a little theory about the nature of things. Sometimes his hobby would even take the form of thinking about the nature of God, or even in that sense about the nature of the gods. but he very seldom thought of pitting his nature of the gods against the gods of nature. It is necessary to insist on this abstraction in the first student of abstractions. He was not so much antagonistic as absent-minded. His hobby might be the universe, but at first the hobby was as private as if it had been numismatics or playing draughts. And even when his wisdom came to be a public possession, and almost a political situation, it was very seldom on that same plane as the popular and religious institutions. Aristotle, with his colossal common sense, was perhaps the greatest of all philosophers, certainly the most practical of all philosophies. But Aristotle would no more have set up the absolute side by side with the Apollo at Delphi as a similar or rival religion than Archimedes would have thought of setting up a lever as a sort of idol or fetish to be substituted for the palladium of the city. Or we might as well imagine Euclid building an altar to an isosceles triangle, or offering sacrifices to the square of the hypotenuse. The one man meditated on metaphysics, and the other man did on mathematics. For the love of truth, or for curiosity, or for the fun of the thing. But that sort of fun never seems to have interfered very much with the other sort of fun, the fun of dancing or singing to celebrate some rascally romance about Zeus becoming a bull or a swan. It is perhaps the proof of a certain superficiality and even insincerity about the popular polytheism that men could be philosophers and even skeptics without disturbing it. These thinkers could move the foundations of the world without altering even the outline of that colored cloud that hung above it in the air. For the thinkers did move the foundations of the world, even when a curious compromise seemed to prevent them from moving the foundations in the city. The two great philosophers of antiquity do appear to us as defenders of sane and even of sacred ideas, their maxims often read like the answers to skeptical questions, too completely answered to be always recorded. Aristotle annihilated 100 anarchists and nature-worshipping cranks by the fundamental statement that man is a political animal. Plato, in the same sense, anticipated the Catholic realism, as attacked by the heretical nominalism, by insisting on the equally fundamental fact that ideas are realities, that ideas exist just as men exist. Plato, however, seemed almost to fancy that ideas exist as men do not exist, or that the men need hardly be considered where their conflict with their ideas. He had something of the social sentiment that we call Fabian in his ideal of fitting the citizen to the city. Like an imaginary head to an ideal hat, the great and glorious as he remains, he has been the father of all faddists. Aristotle anticipated the more fully the sacramental sanity that was to combine the body and soul of things. For he considered the nature of men as well as the nature of morals, and looked to the eyes as well as to the light. But though these great men were in that sense constructive and conservative, they belonged to a world where thought was free to the point of being fanciful. Many other intellects did indeed follow them, some exalting an abstract vision of the future, others following more rationalistically the necessity of the human pursuit of happiness. The former had the name of Stoics, and their name had passed into a proverb for what is indeed one of the main moral ideals of mankind, that of strengthening the mind itself until it is of a texture to resist calamity or even pain. But it is admitted that a great number of the philosophers degenerated into what we still call sophists. They became a sort of professional skeptics who went about asking uncomfortable questions and were handsomely paid for making themselves a nuisance to normal people. It was perhaps an accidental resemblance to such questioning quacks that was responsible for the unpopularity of the great Socrates, whose death might seem to contradict the suggestion of the permanent truce between the philosophers and the gods. But Socrates did not die as a monotheist who denounced polytheism, certainly not as a prophet who denounced idols. It is clear to anyone reading between the lines that there was some notion, right or wrong, of a purely personal influence affecting the morals and perhaps politics. The general compromise remained, whether it was that the Greeks ever thought their myths a joke, or that they thought their theories a joke. There was never any collision in which one really destroyed the other, and there was never any combination in which one was really reconciled with the other. They certainly did not work together. If anything, the philosopher was a rival to the priest. Both seemed to have accepted a sort of separation of functions and remained parts of the same social system. Another important tradition descends from Pythagoras, who is significant because he stands nearest to the Oriental mystics, who must be considered in their turn. He taught a sort of mysticism of mathematics, that number is the ultimate reality. But he also seems to have taught the transmigration of souls like the Brahmins, and to have left to his followers certain traditional tricks of vegetarianism and water drinking very common among the Eastern sages, especially those who figure in fashionable drawing rooms, like those of the later Roman Empire. But in passing to Eastern sages, and the somewhat different atmosphere of the East, we may approach a rather important truth by another path.